The bell above the door chimed softly as Thomas Blackwell entered Hoffman's Piano Emporium for the 47th consecutive Tuesday. Emma Hoffman looked up from the inventory list she'd been pretending to focus on and offered him the gentle smile she'd perfected over the 11 months since his visits had become routine. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwell," she said, though it was actually 2:17 p.m., the exact time he always arrived. "Emma," he acknowledged with a slight nod, his weathered hands already trembling with anticipation or arthritis. She'd never been quite sure which. Probably both. He moved slowly through the showroom, past the gleaming Steinway Grands and the upright Yamahas, past the digital keyboards that he'd once muttered were not real pianos, just expensive toys. His destination was always the same, a modest Baldwin upright in the back corner, its mahogany finish worn smooth in places, its keys slightly yellowed with age. It wasn't the finest instrument in the store. It wasn't even close. But it was the one he touched every single week. Emma watched as Thomas lowered himself onto the bench with the careful precision of someone whose body no longer obeyed commands the way it once had. His hands hovered over the keys for a moment, long, elegant fingers that spoke of a lifetime of music, now gnarled and twisted with arthritis that had stolen everything those fingers used to create. Then, as always, he simply touched them. Not pressing, not playing, just touching. His fingers moved from key to key with a tenderness that made Emma's throat tighten, as though he were greeting old friends he could no longer truly speak to. C, D, E, F, G up and down the keyboard, a caress instead of a performance. She'd asked him once, in the early days, if he'd like to hear the piano played, if she could demonstrate its sound for him. The look of raw pain that had crossed his face made her regret the question instantly. "I know what it sounds like," he'd said quietly. "I remember every note." After that, she'd learned to simply let him be. She busied herself with paperwork at the counter, or pretended to organize sheet music, or polished pianos that didn't need polishing. Anything to give him privacy in his ritual, this strange communion with an instrument he would never play again. But today felt different. Today, Thomas sat at the bench longer than usual before touching the keys. Today, his shoulders carried a weight that seemed heavier than the arthritis, heavier than age. Today, when his fingers finally made contact with the ivory, his whole body shuddered. Emma found herself moving closer without conscious decision, drawn by the palpable grief radiating from the old man. She stopped a respectful distance away, not wanting to intrude but unable to stay away. "Mr. Blackwell," she said softly. "Are you all right?" He didn't look up, but his voice, when it came, was thick with emotion. Today would have been her birthday. My daughter, Sarah, would have been 43. Would have been. 2 words that carried the weight of a tragedy Emma had suspected but never confirmed. She'd imagined many stories to explain Thomas's weekly visits, a former concert pianist robbed of his livelihood by disease, perhaps, or a man mourning his late wife who'd loved music. But a daughter. A lost daughter. "I'm so sorry," Emma whispered, knowing the words were inadequate but having nothing better to offer. Thomas's twisted fingers traced the keys from middle C upward, playing an invisible melody. "She was 8 when she asked me to teach her piano. 8 years old with missing front teeth and hair that wouldn't stay in its braids no matter what her mother did." His voice softened with memory. She had no natural talent, not really. Her fingers were clumsy at first, and she struggled with rhythm. But God, she loved it. She loved music with her whole heart. Emma eased herself onto the bench beside him, leaving a respectful gap between them. "What did you teach her first?" "For Elise," he said, and almost smiled. "Every child learns for Elise. It's practically a law of piano instruction. She murdered it for months, absolutely butchered poor Beethoven. But she never gave up. Every day after school, she'd sit at our piano and practice until dinner time. Sometimes until bedtime. Sometimes until I had to practically drag her away from the keys." His right hand lifted, shaking, and attempted to press down on the E key. His finger barely depressed it enough to produce a sound, weak, brief, a ghost of what a note should be. Thomas's jaw clenched with frustration, and he withdrew his hand as if the key had burned him. "I was a piano teacher for 42 years, he said. Not a famous performer, not a concert pianist. Just a teacher. I taught hundreds of students, maybe thousands over the years. But Sarah was my favorite student. Not because she was my daughter, or not just because of that, but because she understood something that many of my more talented students never did, that music isn't about perfection. It's about expression. It's about pouring yourself into sound and letting it carry what words can't. Emma watched his profile, the way the afternoon light caught the silver in his hair, the deep lines around his eyes that spoke of years of smiling that had been interrupted by something unbearable. By the time she was 12, she was better than competent. By 15, she was genuinely good. She could sight-read complex pieces, play Chopin with real feeling, interpret Debussy in ways that surprised me. She could have been a professional, maybe. But she said his voice broke, and he took a moment to collect himself. She said she didn't want to perform for strangers. She just wanted to play for people she loved. She said music was too personal to share with the whole world. That's beautiful, Emma said softly. That's who she was. Private. Thoughtful. She became a teacher, like me. 3rd grade. She taught children to read, to write, to think. And every evening, she'd come home to the apartment she shared with 2 roommates, and she'd play. She'd call me sometimes, play something over the phone just to share it. Dad, she'd say, listen to this part. I finally figured out the transition that was giving me trouble. And I'd listen, and I'd hear not just the notes, but her joy in having conquered them. Thomas's hands lay in his lap now, curled into themselves like injured birds. The arthritis started about 8 years ago. Just a little stiffness at first, nothing that interfered much. But it got worse. Faster than it should have. Within 2 years, I couldn't play professionally anymore. Couldn't demonstrate for my students. Had to retire from teaching because what's a piano teacher who can't show you how it's done? That must have been devastating, Emma offered. It was, he admitted. Music was my life, and suddenly I was cut off from it. Not just playing, I couldn't even really enjoy listening anymore because all I heard was what I could no longer do. But Sarah made me a promise. He turned to look at Emma for the first time since he'd started speaking, and she was startled by the raw emotion in his eyes. She promised me that music would never truly leave my life. That even if I couldn't play, I could still experience it through her. She'd play for me, she said. She'd be my hands on the keys. She'd learn any piece I wanted to hear, master anything I'd always loved. You gave me music, Dad, she told me. Now I'll keep it alive for both of us. Emma felt tears pricking her own eyes, though she didn't yet know the end of this story. But she could feel it coming, could sense the grief building like a storm on the horizon. She came over every Sunday. Every single Sunday for 3 years. She'd play for hours, everything from Beethoven to Billy Joel, from classical to contemporary. She'd play the pieces I'd loved, the ones I'd taught her, the ones she'd discovered on her own. And I'd sit in my chair and close my eyes and let the music wash over me, let it fill the empty places that losing my ability to play had created. Those Sundays where he paused, searching for words. They were everything. What happened? Emma asked, though part of her didn't want to know, didn't want the story to go where it was inevitably heading. Thomas's hands began to shake more violently, and he pressed them together to still them. It was a Tuesday. She was driving home from work, probably thinking about what to make for dinner, or what piece she'd play for me that coming Sunday, or whether she'd remembered to pay her electric bill, all the mundane thoughts that fill up an ordinary day. A drunk driver ran a red light going 60 miles an hour. The police said she died instantly. Said she didn't suffer. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Emma's sharp intake of breath. For years ago this March, Thomas continued, his voice now eerily steady, as though he'd cried all the tears he had and found some strange calm on the other side of drowning. For years since I've heard real music. For years since I've felt anything but silence where there should be sound. Mr. Blackwell, Emma started, but he held up one twisted hand. After she died, I couldn't go near a piano. Couldn't even look at one. I sold my own piano, the one I'd owned for 35 years, the one I'd taught Sarah on. Sold it to a young family with a daughter who was just starting lessons. I couldn't keep it. Every time I looked at it, All I could see was Sarah at 8 years old with those missing front teeth, massacring for Elise with such joy. What changed? Emma asked. What made you start coming here? Thomas looked down at the keys, his fingers hovering just above them. About a year ago, I realized I was losing her. Not just grieving her, losing her. The memories were starting to fade around the edges, becoming less vivid. I could no longer quite remember the exact sound of her laugh, or the way she'd bite her lower lip when she was concentrating on a difficult passage, or the feeling of her hugging me goodbye after those Sunday sessions. And I was terrified. Because if I lost the memories, what did I have left? His index finger stretched out, trembling, and barely managed to touch middle C. I thought if I could touch the keys again, maybe I could remember. Maybe I could hold on to her somehow. So I found your store, chose it randomly off the internet, and I came in. And when I touched a piano for the first time in years, I could suddenly hear her playing. Not really, not actually. But in my mind, so clearly. I could hear her working through Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the one she'd played for me the last Sunday before she died. So you kept coming back, Emma said, understanding dawning. Every week. Same day, same time, Tuesday at 2:17, the exact time the accident happened. I come here and I touch these keys and I keep my promise to Sarah. Emma's brow furrowed. Your promise. She made me promise that music would never leave my life. But the promise went both ways. I promised her that I'd always love music, always find a way to connect with it, even when it was hard, even when it hurt. I come here because touching these keys, even though I can't play them, even though all I can manage is weak, broken sounds, is how I keep music in my life. It's how I honor her memory. It's how I tell her that what she gave me, what she sacrificed her Sundays to give me, still matters. Still means everything. A tear slid down Thomas's weathered cheek, and he made no move to wipe it away. The cruelest irony is that she died keeping music alive for me, and now I can't hear her play anymore. Can't feel the joy she wanted me to feel. There's just silence, and these useless hands, and this hollow ache that never quite goes away. Emma sat quietly for a long moment, her mind racing. She'd worked in this piano store for 5 years, since she was 22, fresh out of music school with a performance degree she'd never quite figured out what to do with. She'd taken this job as temporary, something to pay bills while she figured out her real path. 5 years later, she was still here, still selling pianos to other people's children, still listening to other people's music. She'd watched Thomas Blackwell come in every week for almost a year. She'd wondered about him, worried about him sometimes, respected his privacy always. But she'd never truly understood until now. Mr. Blackwell, she said slowly, an idea forming. What if you didn't have to just touch the keys? What if you could hear music again? Real music, not just memories. He turned to her, confused. I don't need you to play for me, Emma. I appreciate the thought, but... Not me playing for you, she interrupted. You. Playing. I can't play, he said flatly, holding up his twisted hands. Look at them. I can barely press a key hard enough to make a sound. I certainly can't play a piece of music. No, Emma agreed. You can't play with your hands. But what if there was another way? She stood and walked quickly to the office in the back of the store, returning moments later with her laptop. She set it on the piano's music stand and began typing rapidly, pulling up websites, scrolling through information. Adaptive technology for musicians with disabilities, she said, reading as she searched. There are people who've developed systems for playing music without traditional hand movement. Eye tracking software that can control digital instruments. Foot pedals that can trigger notes. Sip and puff controllers. Brain-computer interfaces that are still experimental but showing promise. Thomas stared at the screen, then at Emma, his expression caught between hope and skepticism. I don't understand. Mr. Blackwell, you made a promise to Sarah that music would never leave your life. And you've kept that promise by coming here, by touching these keys. But maybe there's a way to keep it even more fully. Maybe there's a way for you to actually play again, just differently than before. I'm 73 years old, he said quietly. Too old to learn new tricks, especially complicated technological ones. Sarah learned to play piano with clumsy fingers and no rhythm, Emma countered gently. Because she loved it enough to push through the difficulty. You taught hundreds of students, some of whom probably seemed hopeless at first. You know that desire matters more than natural ability. She could see she was getting through to him, see the hope beginning to war with the fear in his eyes. I don't know if I can, he whispered. You don't know if you can't, Emma replied. And wouldn't Sarah want you to try? The question hung in the air between them. Thomas looked down at his hands, then at the piano keys, then back at Emma's laptop screen showing images of musicians using adaptive technology to create music despite various physical limitations. She'd tell me I was being stubborn, he finally said, and there was the ghost of a smile in his voice. She'd say that I taught her to never give up on music, so I had no right to give up either. Then let's start researching, Emma said. Let's figure out what might work for you. And Mr. Blackwell? You don't have to do this alone. I'll help you. Every step. Why? He asked, and the vulnerability in that single word nearly broke her heart. Why would you do this for me? Emma thought about her own life, about the performance degree gathering dust while she sold pianos to other people. About the music she'd loved once, but had let slip away because it was hard, because she wasn't the best, because she'd been afraid of not being perfect. About how she'd been drifting through years without purpose, without passion, without the thing that had once made her feel alive. Because, she said honestly, I think maybe I need to keep a promise too. I promised myself once that music would be my life. And somewhere along the way, I stopped keeping that promise. Maybe helping you keep yours will help me remember how to keep mine. The following Tuesday, Thomas arrived at 2:17 as always, but this time Emma was waiting with printouts, her laptop, and a list of organizations that specialized in adaptive music technology. They spent 2 hours researching, discussing, discovering possibilities that Thomas had never imagined existed. By the end of the session, they'd identified a system that might work, a combination of eye-tracking software and a simplified touchpad system that required minimal hand pressure. It was expensive, and it would require significant learning and practice. But it was possible. I'll start saving, Thomas said. Maybe in 6 months or a year. Or, Emma interrupted, we could start a fundraiser. Tell your story. There are grants for people with disabilities pursuing music. There are organizations dedicated to exactly this kind of thing. I don't want to be a charity case, Thomas said stiffly. You're not a charity case. You're a piano teacher who gave his life to music and deserves a chance to reconnect with it. That's not charity. That's justice. Over the following weeks, Emma threw herself into the project with an energy she hadn't felt in years. She contacted disability rights organizations, music therapy foundations, and adaptive technology companies. She wrote Thomas's story, with his permission, and submitted it to grant programs. She created a small fundraising campaign online, sharing it with the local music community. The response was overwhelming. Former students of Thomas's emerged from decades past, sharing stories of how he'd taught them not just piano but love of music. Local musicians contributed. Music schools donated. Within 2 months, they had enough money not just for the adaptive system, but for a quality digital piano to use with it. When the equipment arrived, Thomas stood in Emma's store, which had begun to feel like his store too, his space, his sanctuary, and stared at it all with tears streaming down his face. I don't know if I can do this, he admitted. I don't know if I can handle trying and failing. What if I can't learn it? What if I'm too old, too stubborn, too broken? Emma took his twisted hands in hers, the first time she'd ever touched him. Then you'll be no worse off than you are now. But Mr. Blackwell, what if you can? What if you learn this, and you play again, and you keep your promise to Sarah in a way that's even fuller than touching silent keys? What if I disappoint her? He whispered. You could never disappoint her, Emma said firmly. She loved you. And love doesn't demand perfection. It just asks that we try. Learning the adaptive system was harder than either of them had anticipated. The eye tracking required intense concentration and gave Thomas headaches. The touchpads were sensitive, triggering notes at the slightest pressure, which meant his tremoring hands sometimes created chaos. The software had a learning curve steep enough to frustrate even Emma, who was comfortable with technology. But Thomas persisted. Every Tuesday at 2:17 he arrived. And now, instead of just touching keys, he worked. He practiced. He swore sometimes, in creative ways that made Emma bite her lip to keep from laughing. He got frustrated and wanted to quit, and Emma wouldn't let him. "One more time," she'd say. "Just one more time." And he'd try again. 3 months into the process, Thomas managed to play a complete C major scale. It was slow, halting, each note a battle. But it was a scale. It was music. It was proof that the impossible was merely very, very difficult. He cried when he finished. Emma cried with him. "Did you hear that?" he asked her, his voice filled with wonder. "Did you hear it?" "I heard it," she confirmed. "You played." "I played," he repeated, as if testing the truth of the words. "I actually played." 6 months in, he could manage simple melodies. "Mary Had a Little Lamb" had never sounded so triumphant. "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" had never carried so much weight. Each note was a victory, each complete phrase a miracle. And slowly, something else began to change. Thomas started arriving at times other than 2:17 on Tuesdays. He'd stop by on Thursday afternoons or Saturday mornings, whenever Emma could spare time to work with him. The visits were no longer tethered to the moment of tragedy, but spread throughout the week, throughout his life, like music should be. Emma, meanwhile, found herself playing again. She'd bring her own pieces to practice while Thomas worked, and sometimes they'd play together, her on a traditional piano, him on his adaptive system, creating strange duets that wouldn't win any competitions, but filled them both with joy. She remembered why she'd fallen in love with music in the first place. Not for perfection or performance, but for the sheer pleasure of creation. 8 months after they'd started, Thomas sat down at his adaptive system and said, "I want to try something." "What?" Emma asked. "For Elise," he said. "The first piece Sarah learned. The one she murdered for months. I want to play it for her." "Mr. Blackwell, that's a lot more complex than what you've been practicing. Maybe we should work up to." "I want to play it for her," he repeated firmly. "Even if I murder it worse than she did. Even if it takes me a month of Tuesdays to get through it. I want to play my daughter's song." So they worked on it. Phrase by phrase, measure by measure, note by painstaking note. Thomas's concentration was fierce, his determination absolute. When his eyes grew tired from tracking, he rested and tried again. When his hands trembled too much for the touchpads, he adjusted the sensitivity and tried again. When the software glitched or the system failed, he waited patiently for Emma to fix it and tried again. 5 weeks later, on a Tuesday at 2:17, the time that had once marked tragedy but was now reclaimed for hope, Thomas played for Elise from beginning to end. It wasn't perfect. The tempo wavered. Some notes were slightly off. The dynamic range was limited by the technology. But it was music. Real, actual music. And it was beautiful because of what it represented: a father's love, a daughter's memory, a promise kept. When the final note faded, Thomas sat in silence for a long moment. Then he spoke, not to Emma, but to someone who couldn't hear, but perhaps somehow could. "I did it, Sarah," he said softly. "Music never left my life. Just like I promised. Just like you promised. We kept our promises to each other." Emma wiped tears from her eyes and did something she'd been planning for this moment. She pulled out her phone and played a recording, something she'd spent the last week putting together, hoping she'd need it. Thomas's own voice came through the speaker, recorded from their practice sessions. She was 8 years old with missing front teeth and hair that wouldn't stay in its braids. Then her own voice. "What did you teach her first?" "Thomas. For Elise. Every child learns for Elise." And then, underneath his words, Emma had laid in the music, Thomas's recording of For Elise, the imperfect, halting, absolutely genuine version he'd just played. "I made you something," she said. "A recording of you playing Sarah's song, with you talking about her learning it. So you can keep it. So you can remember not just her learning it, but you playing it for her, all these years later." Thomas took the phone with shaking hands and listened to the whole thing. When it finished, he looked at Emma with an expression of such profound gratitude that she had to look away. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for giving this back to me." "You gave it back to yourself," Emma corrected. "I just helped a little." A year after Thomas had first told Emma about Sarah, he played a recital. Not a public concert, nothing so grand. Just a small gathering in the piano store after hours. A few of his former students, some of Emma's music school friends, a couple of people from the disability advocacy organizations that had helped fund his equipment. He played for Elise, of course. But he also played pieces he'd learned since, simpler ones, more complex ones, pieces by Beethoven and Chopin and Debussy, pieces Sarah had played for him during those Sunday sessions that now felt both impossibly distant and immediately present. Before he played, he spoke to the small audience. My daughter once told me that music was too personal to share with the whole world. She only wanted to play for people she loved. I'm not playing for the world tonight. I'm playing for the people in this room who helped me find my way back to music when I thought I'd lost it forever. And I'm playing for Sarah, who never let me give up on the thing we both loved most. The performance wasn't perfect, but it was real. And it was filled with love. After everyone had left, Emma and Thomas sat in the quiet store, surrounded by pianos in the dim evening light. I've been thinking, Thomas said, about what comes next. What do you mean? There must be other people like me. Musicians who've lost the ability to play, who think their connection to music is gone forever. What if we could help them? What if we started a program here, in this store, teaching adaptive music technology to people with disabilities? Emma's eyes widened. Mr. Blackwell, that's a huge undertaking. I know. But you said once that helping me keep my promise helped you remember your own. Maybe helping others keep theirs would give us both something even more meaningful than we've found already. Emma looked around the store, the space that had been just a job for so long but had become something more. A place of healing. A place of second chances. A place where promises were kept. I think that's a beautiful idea, she said. I think Sarah would love it. I think she would too, Thomas agreed. He placed his hands on the piano keys beside him, not his adaptive system, just a regular piano. His fingers couldn't press hard enough to make sound, but the gesture was familiar now. Comforting. You know what the hardest part of losing her was? What? It wasn't the grief, though God knows that was awful. It wasn't even losing her music. It was feeling like I'd failed my last promise to her. Like by giving up on music after she died, I was giving up on her. Like I was letting her down. You never gave up, Emma said firmly. You came here every Tuesday. You touched these keys. You honored her memory in the only way you could. But now I can honor her in more ways, Thomas said. I can play. I can teach others to play. I can help people find their way back to music, just like you helped me. And every time I do that, every time I help someone else keep their connection to the thing they love, I'll be keeping my promise to Sarah. Not just for me, but for everyone who's lost something precious and needs to find it again. Emma smiled through tears. Then let's do it. Let's build something that would make her proud. They shook hands on it, his twisted and trembling, hers steady and sure, and in that moment, a new promise was made. Not to replace the old ones, but to extend them. To spread them outward like ripples on water, touching lives they'd never meet, creating music they'd never hear, but making the world a little bit better because two people had refused to let loss be the final word. 2 years later, the adaptive music program at Hoffman's Piano Emporium was in full operation. Thomas and Emma had taught 17 students, people with arthritis, nerve damage, paralysis, and other conditions that had stolen their ability to play music traditionally. They'd secured additional grants, partnered with rehabilitation centers, and even begun working with music therapists to expand the program's reach. Every Tuesday at 2:17, Thomas still arrived at the store. But now, instead of touching keys in silent remembrance, he taught. He encouraged. He told his students about Sarah, about promises, about how music could never truly be lost as long as you refused to let it go. And every week, before he left, he'd sit at his adaptive system and play for Elise. Sometimes perfectly, sometimes imperfectly. Always meaningfully. Emma would listen, no matter what else she was doing. She'd stop and listen to every note because she understood what it meant. Not just a father honoring a daughter, but a man keeping a promise that had saved his life. A promise that music would never leave. A promise that love, even in the face of unimaginable loss, endures. On the 4th anniversary of Sarah's death, Thomas played a concert at a local community center. His students attended, as did dozens of people who'd heard about the program and wanted to support it. Emma sat in the front row, watching this man who'd come into her store broken and lost, now sharing his music with a room full of people. He played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the last piece Sarah had played for him. His eyes tracked across the censor, his fingers barely touched the pads, and the music that emerged was imperfect and beautiful and filled with love. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. But Thomas looked past everyone to a spot in the back of the room, as if he could see someone standing there. Someone with missing front teeth and hair that wouldn't stay in braids. Someone smiling with pride at what her father had accomplished. "I kept my promise, sweetheart," he whispered. "Music never left my life." And in the silence that followed the applause, in the space between what was lost and what was found, Thomas Blackwell felt something he hadn't felt in 4 years: peace. The keys had given him back his music. But more importantly, they'd given him back his purpose. His hope. His reason to keep moving forward. They'd given him a way to transform grief into grace, loss into legacy, and a daughter's memory into a living, breathing promise that would touch hundreds of lives for years to come. Emma watched him and thought about her own journey, from a directionless graduate selling pianos to a person with purpose, with passion, with a mission that mattered. Thomas had taught her that keeping promises to the ones we love sometimes means reinventing what those promises look like. That honoring memory doesn't mean staying frozen in the past, but carrying what was beautiful about the past forward into a future that's still being written. As they locked up the community center that night, Thomas turned to Emma. "Thank you," he said, "for seeing me, for helping me, for giving me a reason to keep going." "You gave yourself the reason," Emma replied. "I just showed you the door. You were the one brave enough to walk through it." They stood together in the parking lot, two people who'd been strangers brought together by music and grief and the stubborn refusal to let either define them. "Same time next Tuesday?" Emma asked. Thomas smiled, a real smile, full and genuine. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." He drove away into the night, and Emma stood watching until his taillights disappeared. Then she looked up at the stars, at the vast universe spinning overhead, and thought about promises and music and the mysterious ways that broken things sometimes heal into something even stronger than they were before. Inside Hoffman's Piano Emporium, 17 pianos sat silent in the darkness, waiting for Tuesday morning and the students who'd come to learn that music never truly leaves. That even when hands fail and hearts break, there are always new ways to create, new ways to love, new ways to keep the promises that matter most. And somewhere, in the space between memory and hope, a young woman with missing front teeth and unstoppable determination smiled at her father and whispered, "I'm proud of you, Dad. I always was. I always will be." The piano keys waited, patient and eternal, for the next person who needed to remember that some promises transcend even death, and that music, real music, the kind that lives in the heart, can never truly be silenced.